Alright everyone, so I'm going to talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a subject dear to my heart. I'm not a therapist by any means, but this is something that I've studied quite a bit, and I found these techniques really, really useful in a lot of different areas of life. But I'm just going to give you some basic principles of CBT today. CBT is what it's usually called. And so first of all, to start off, there are really two types of things in CBT. There's the cognitive part and the behavioral part. And these actually come from two different schools of thought originally, so they're really quite distinct from each other. And the behavioral part actually you can decompose further into what's known as classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So first I'm going to talk about those two subjects, and then I'll go back to the cognitive part. Alright, so first, what is classical conditioning? This got its start in roughly the 1920s with Pavlov and a number of his famous experiments. The basic idea in classical conditioning, you're trying to get the brain to either of a human or of an animal, to associate two different things. One of those is a neutral stimulus, and the other is a stimulus that causes some reaction, and you're trying to get the neutral stimulus to cause that reaction. So the classic experiment is, what Pavlov realized is when he feeds his dogs, they begin to salivate. But when he uses a bell before he feeds his dogs, he can actually get them to start salivating at the bell. And the key here is that this is not something in their conscious awareness. You don't control your salivation. This is really an automatic behavior that's getting associated with the bell ringing. Alright, so we often call the bell, we would call it the conditioned stimulus, because it's the thing we're trying to condition. And we call the food, in this case, the unconditioned stimulus, because we don't need to condition it, it already causes a reaction. Let's talk about temporal ordering of events. So in the classic experiment, he rings the bell, and then he gives them food. And in fact, this ordering is very, very important. If you give them food and then you ring the bell, it actually can have the opposite effect. Because what happens is the correlation built in the brain is sort of a negative correlation that says the food has stopped. And that's the bell gets associated with the food having been stopped. And actually, you could train the salivation response to stop at the bell ringing if you did the bell ringing after the food instead of before it. The fastest way to train using classical conditioning is to actually, in this case, you'd have the bell ringing before the food and perhaps actually overlapping when the food is being fed. And there's also this issue of the similarity of different stimuli. So in this case, what would happen if we used a bell, but we didn't use the same bell that we trained the dogs for? And it turns out, so Pavlov did an experiment about this, and what he found is that the relationship between how much salivation there was directly related to the relationship between the tones in the bell that they were trained on and the tones in the bell that he was then ringing. So the idea is if you use a bell that is quite different in frequency to the original bell, they'll salivate less, whereas if you use one that's more similar, they'll salivate more. And so this is a really important idea. It's called generalization, is that if you train something using classical conditioning, it doesn't just apply to that exact stimulus. It can apply to similar stimuli as well. Okay, there's also an important concept known as extinguishment. And so basically, as you might think, if you train a dog to respond to a bell, and then you start using the bell ringing without any food associated with it, eventually what's going to happen is that it's going to lose this reaction. The salivation will become less and less progressively over time, and eventually you'll get a full extinguishment. There will no longer be any salivation when the bell rings. Now, what's really interesting though, you might think that this means that the dog no longer has been trained to salivate at a bell. That's actually not true, because if you pair the bell ringing with food just one more time, it often can get back the full effect of the training. And then after that, you could distinguish it again by doing another series of bell ringings where the salivation would become less and less and less. So once you've been trained to do something through classical conditioning, you can get that effect back again very rapidly, even after it's been extinguished. Now there's a famous little experiment, highly unethical by today's standards, that was done on humans. It's called the Little Albert experiment. It was done on an 11-year-old child, 11-month-year-old child. And basically what it consisted of, they brought out a white rat and they had the child play with the white rat, and the child was not afraid of it. And then they did this experiment again, but this time they would start banging on a pipe behind the child's head when the white rat would come out. And then they would do this repeatedly. What they found is that they were actually able to get to the point where the child was anxious just at the sight of the rat. And this effect, I think they tested it 5 days later, the effect still held. But what's really interesting is that the child also started to have anxiety at seeing dogs and rabbits. And so this is, again, this idea of generalization, is that the child didn't just become afraid of the rat, it became afraid of sort of similar things. Now this experiment, I should mention, the results of this experiment are for some reason really commonly exaggerated, but it does seem that they were able to achieve some fear that was trained. There's also another experiment that sort of shows that these ideas are evolutionary in nature. And so in this experiment, what they did is they gave people electric shocks concurrent with showing them certain objects. So sometimes they would show them a mushroom, a flower, a gun. Other times they would show them a spider or a snake. They made sure, of course, in advance that the people weren't afraid of any of these objects to start with. And what they found is, in all cases, they were able to induce fear of the objects. And this fear would actually persist for a while, even after they had done the training with electric shocks. But what was really interesting about this is that it was much easier to train a fear of snakes and spiders than it was of these other objects, even though you think a gun would be considered just as dangerous, or an electrical outlet. And in fact, it was harder to extinguish the fear of snakes and spiders. So it seems like there might be a biological origin for this classical conditioning, that our brains are pre-programmed to be more likely to respond to certain stimuli that we might be more likely to see in our evolutionarily ancestral environment. All right, so this leads me to the second type of behaviorism, which is operant conditioning. And operant conditioning, it was sort of founded by B.F. Skinner in the 1930s. And it's different than classical conditioning because it has to do with voluntary behavior. And it tries to affect voluntary behavior rather than automatic behavior through the use of positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and punishment. And so a lot of people get confused about what these terms mean. So first of all, what is positive reinforcement? Positive reinforcement is basically when you do a behavior that causes your trainee, the thing you're trying to train, to do whatever they're doing more often. So typically you think of this as a reward. So the classic example is you tell your dog to sit. If your dog does sit, you give it a treat. That's positive reinforcement. Then there's negative reinforcement. And now negative reinforcement is not the same thing as punishment. Negative reinforcement is about removing something that the creature doesn't like. So just like positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement also reinforces behavior. It causes it to occur more often. So a couple examples of this. Let's say your dog strays off the path while you're walking it, and you hold its leash tight when it does this. So it's unpleasant for the dog. Now, what's going to happen is as soon as the dog walks back into the path, the leash is going to be relaxed, and this is a form of negative reinforcement. The dog is having a negative removed as soon as it does the desired behavior. Let's see. So another example of negative reinforcement, let's say you're trying to train your dog to sit. You take away your dog's toy. You tell your dog to sit, and you dangle the toy over its head so it's really frustrated. And then as soon as it sits, you give it the toy. So you've removed this frustration. So you've removed something it doesn't like. And now on to punishment. So punishment is you tell your dog to sit, your dog doesn't sit, you hit the dog with a stick. And so what do these terms mean, positive and negative? So positive is about adding something. So you can actually have an idea of positive punishment, would be like hitting a dog with a stick. Or negative punishment, which would be like taking away a dog's toy, removing something that it wants. So they're both forms of punishment. And then there's this idea of reinforcement versus punishment. Reinforcement is causing a behavior to occur more often. Punishment is when you cause it to occur less often. So that's the basic terminology. And this raises the question, which of these is better if we want to train someone or something to do something? And so there's sort of some pros and cons of the different techniques. So first of all, reinforcement is often much more specific than punishment. So for example, if your dog, let's say you tell your dog to sit, it doesn't sit, you hit it with a stick. The problem is the dog doesn't know what it was supposed to do necessarily. If the dog, you've just punished the dog, but it doesn't necessarily know for what exactly was punished or what you want it to do, that you actually want it to sit. Whereas if when it sits, you give the dog a treat, then you're actually rewarding this behavior. It knows exactly what it's supposed to do. It needs to sit to get the reward. And so the specificity can really actually be a big advantage of using reinforcement. There's also this question of eagerness. When you're using positive reinforcement especially, the trainee likes positive reinforcement because by definition, pretty much, you're giving it something that is going to encourage its behavior. So if you play a game with your dog where you tell it to sit and you give it a treat, if it does it, it wants treats, so it wants to engage with you. And furthermore, it's going to tend to build a positive rapport between you and the animal or whatever else it is you're training. Whereas with punishment, it does the reverse. Punishment creates a negative rapport. It creates avoidance behavior. the creature doesn't want to engage in the activity and possibly doesn't even want to engage with you at all. So it might just avoid you altogether. So that's actually an interesting comment when it comes to dog training, because, for example, let's say that every time you catch your dog peeing on the carpet, you hit the dog. Now, you might be training the dog not to pee on the carpet, but you might actually just be training the dog to pee on the carpet when you're not in the room, because that's an equally valid response to what the stimulus you've been giving. Feel free to go sit down if you want. All right, so this raises the question, all right, when is punishment a good idea? And so there's this expert on operant conditioning. She was a former head dolphin trainer at an aquarium, and she did a lot of other interesting stuff. She's got this great book called Don't Shoot the Dog about operant conditioning, and she talks about when punishment is actually good. And she says, basically, if the following criteria are all met, then punishment can work well. Basically, if the subject understands what it's being punished for, obviously if it doesn't understand what it's being punished for, it's not going to be effective. Second, if its motivation to do the action is not that great. So when you're really highly motivated to do something, punishment may not be a big deterrent. Third, the fear of punishment is going to have to be very large compared to the motivation to do the activity. So if the activity, the more motivated the trainee is to do the activity, the more punishment you're going to have to threaten, essentially. Fourth, the subject is going to have to actually be in control of that behavior. So, for example, some young kids are not in control of bedwetting, so punishing them for bedwetting is actually a horrible idea. And then the last thing is that it has to do with the timing of the punishment. If the punishment doesn't occur quick enough to when the activity is done, it's going to be totally useless. If your dog pees in the carpet and then an hour later you hit it, it's going to have absolutely no idea what it's being punished for, and it's not going to learn. Another thing to note is that punishment doesn't tend to work very well if something's an established habit. It tends to work better when something is a behavior that's just been started. And it also is not necessarily going to be very effective for things or for creatures that are used to being punished. So if you get punished all the time, then adding a threat of punishment actually may do very little to train a creature. So I should mention, it's very easy to talk about dogs when you're saying all this stuff, but most of this applies to humans as well. Obviously, we tend to have more awareness of what we're doing, but operant conditioning and cognitive conditioning both work on human beings. So I should just mention, so what do professional trainers do? Well, actually, there are a lot of professional trainers who almost never use punishment. They very rarely use it, and they do almost everything by positive and negative reinforcement. And in fact, they achieve really incredible stuff, like getting dolphins to do backflips and jump through hoops just through positive and negative reinforcement. So you generally don't need to use punishment. Alright, so one thing to note about reinforcing is that reinforcement is really dependent on the subject itself. So if you're really hungry, using food to reinforce you, it might work well because you want the food. But if you're really full, actually forcing you to eat food might actually be a punishment. So there's no such thing as a universal reinforcer. The reinforcer is going to depend on the wants or the feelings of the creature at any given moment. And there's also this really interesting idea of the trainer being reinforced. So there's certain times when it's not just the trainee getting reinforced, but the trainer as well. And so a really interesting example of this is, it comes up in parenting, where a child's throwing a temper tantrum because they want a toy or something like this. Say they're at the store, and the parent finally gets fed up, buys them the toy. Now the parent is positively reinforcing the child to continue throwing temper tantrums because the child gets what they want. But they're actually negatively reinforcing themselves to give in to the child's wants. Because what's happened is, as soon as they bought the toy, the child stopped crying. So there's a removal of a negative, so they're being negatively reinforced. So it actually goes both ways. The child has worse behavior, but then the parent has worse behavior as well. There's also an interesting example that comes up in horse racing. Let's say you're a jockey, and when you get in the habit of whipping the horse to make it run faster. But running faster is a good thing to you. That's something that's actually reinforcing. And so every time you whip it, you get this sort of cognitive reward for doing so. So you're punishing the horse for running slowly, but you're also positively reinforcing yourself for whipping it.